The girl they tried to silence. The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of high heels echoed sharply through the cavernous courthouse hallway. Every step was deliberate, a battle drum marking the march toward war. Brielle Townsend's heels were no strangers to these halls, nor to the glances that followed her, the sneers, the smirks, the whispers that always seemed to follow her arrival. Some lawyers got respect simply by walking in. She had to fight for every ounce of it. The courthouse was older than her grandmother's Sunday hymnal, with marble columns and walls that seemed to sigh under the weight of decades of decisions, some just, others far from it. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of leather briefcases, stale coffee, and ego. Lawyers clustered in small huddles, navy suits blending into a sea of privilege. She knew most of them by name. The old guard who saw her as an anomaly, an outsider, a black woman who somehow slipped through the cracks and dared to sit at their table. But today, Brielle wasn't here to sit at anyone's table. She was here to break it. Her grip tightened around her leather briefcase, the worn handle molded to her palm after years of late nights, cold dinners, and relentless study. Inside was her sword, not made of steel, but of paper, pages and pages of irrefutable proof that Sterling Financial had robbed elderly clients blind. Retirement savings drained, home equity stolen, health insurance policies restructured into useless pieces of paper. Sterling Financial had built an empire on the backs of the most vulnerable, and Brielle was about to bring that empire crumbling down. If, of course, she could make it past him. The honorable, or not so honorable, Judge Leonard Hughes. The name alone tightened her stomach. Hughes was infamous, not for brilliance, not for legal insight, but for wielding his power like a club, battering attorneys, especially those who didn't fit his mold. Young, female, black, anyone who didn't walk into his courtroom carrying a Harvard degree and a country club membership. Rumor had it, Hughes didn't just dislike women like Brielle. He despised them. Brielle wasn't just any woman, though. She was the daughter of Carla Townsend, the woman who raised 3 kids alone, taught them to stand taller every time the world tried to make them kneel. Carla Townsend, who told her daughter, "The only person who can make you small is you." So as Brielle pushed open the heavy wooden doors to Courtroom 6B, she straightened her spine, adjusted the pearl buttons on her charcoal gray blazer, and stepped into the arena. The air inside was thick with expectation. Lawyers already seated at the defense table looked up and then quickly backed down when they saw her. The jury, mostly older faces, some the very people Sterling Financial had scammed, watched her with a mix of curiosity and cautious hope. And then there was him. Judge Hughes, seated at his elevated bench like a king on a throne. His white hair was neatly combed, his robe pristine, but it couldn't mask the permanent sneer tugging at the corner of his mouth. His eyes swept across the room, landing on Brielle like a hawk spotting prey. "Morning," he drawled, voice oozing condescension. "And who might you be?" "Defense's paralegal." There was a ripple of quiet laughter from the back of the room. Brielle felt the heat creep up her neck, but she forced her expression into perfect, polished neutrality. "No, Your Honor," she replied, her voice ringing clear and calm. "I'm Brielle Townsend, lead counsel for the plaintiffs." The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief. The sneer on Hughes' face faltered for just a moment, just long enough for Brielle to see the flicker of realization. She wasn't a secretary. She wasn't there to fetch coffee. She was there to tear his courtroom apart. "Well then," Hughes said after a beat, recovering his smirk, "let's hope you're better at law than fetching coffee." The snickers from the defense table, led by Sterling Financial's lead counsel, Nathan Kavanaugh, a walking fossil of corporate corruption, didn't faze her. Brielle had stood in rooms like this before. She had felt the heat of their disdain. But what they never understood was that she thrived in it. This was her element. Brielle's opening statement began not with thunder, but with a whisper. She told the story of Clara McNeil, an 82-year-old widow who invested her life savings into Sterling Financial's Guaranteed Growth Fund, only to find herself evicted when her accounts mysteriously drained. She spoke of Jerome Patterson, a retired school principal, who lost not only his pension but his dignity when Sterling used his personal data to open fraudulent lines of credit in his name. Her voice didn't rise until the end. "These are not numbers," she said, her voice filling the courtroom. "These are lives. These are our parents, our grandparents, people who spent their lives building, saving, trusting." She paused, looking directly at the jury. And that trust was shattered. Nathan Kavanaugh rose lazily, buttoning his designer jacket. "Your Honor, I'd like to move to exclude this irrelevant emotional appeal." Vriel's jaw tightened. "It's not irrelevant, Your Honor. It's the truth." Judge Hughes leaned back, steepling his fingers. "We'll see, Miss Townsend. We'll see." The first blow had been struck. But Vriel knew this was only the beginning. Later that day, in her office, the cramped but orderly space where she had built her career from nothing, Vriel sat with Maya, her paralegal and oldest friend. Maya's curls were pulled into a lopsided bun, her floral blouse wrinkled after hours of gathering last-minute documents. "That man's a relic," Maya muttered, slapping down a stack of depositions. "He's gonna block everything." "Let him try," Vriel said, though her stomach twisted at the thought. They both knew the truth. Judge Hughes wasn't just an obstacle. He was a gatekeeper, a man who had built his reputation on keeping lawyers like Vriel out. He didn't just bend the law to his will. He twisted it, stretched it until justice was unrecognizable. "Don't you dare give up," Maya said, softer now. "They want you to get mad. They want you to lose it so they can say you're emotional and unprofessional. Don't let them have that." Vriel ran her fingers along the edge of her briefcase. Inside was everything they needed. Every account statement, every forged signature, every internal memo where Sterling executives joked about their easy marks. It was enough to win, if the judge let it see the light of day. "Tomorrow," Vriel said quietly, "we stop playing defense." Maya raised an eyebrow. "You thinking what I think you're thinking?" Vriel smiled, the kind of smile that made Maya's breath catch. Sharp, dangerous, like the flash of a blade. "Tomorrow, we make them play by our rules." The sun dipped low, spilling gold across her desk. Tomorrow would come too soon. But Vriel Townsend was ready. Tomorrow, they wouldn't just fight for justice. They would demand it. Obstruction in the court. The fluorescent lights in Vriel Townsend's office buzzed softly, casting a cold glow over the stacks of legal briefs, deposition transcripts, and annotated financial statements sprawled across her desk. Outside the window, the city's early morning pulse was already alive. Car horns, delivery trucks, and the low hum of conversations filtering through the thin glass. Vriel's fingers skimmed over the glossy surface of a photograph. It was a picture of Mrs. Eleanora Graham, 76 years old, standing in front of her now foreclosed home. The edges of the photo were curled slightly, worn from handling. Her smile in the photo was gentle, the kind that mothers reserve for school portraits and graduations, but her eyes held the sadness of someone who had lost something irreplaceable. That was what this case was about. Not headlines, not proving herself, people. Yet the war she was about to fight had little to do with the actual evidence. It was about power, who had it, who controlled it, and who they were determined to keep away from it. Maya, her paralegal, best friend, and occasional therapist, shuffled in with 2 cups of coffee, the steam curling into the air like fragile smoke signals. Late night, Vriel accepted the cup with a half-smile, more like no night. They both knew the truth. Sleep had been a distant memory ever since Judge Hughes had been assigned to the case. His reputation was legendary, not for brilliance or even-handedness, but for his ability to crush attorneys who didn't fit his mold. Especially women. Especially black women. Maya dropped into the chair across from Vriel's desk, bare feet tucked under her floral skirt, her heels abandoned by the door. "I pulled some records on Hughes last night," she said, her voice low. "It's worse than we thought." Brielle sipped her coffee, the bitterness cutting through her exhaustion. "Go on." Maya flipped open her tablet, scrolling through her notes. "In the last 5 years, female attorneys arguing civil cases in his court have a win rate of," she glanced up, her expression grim, "less than 9%. Brielle exhaled sharply, though it wasn't a surprise. "And black female attorneys?" Maya's jaw clenched. "Less than 4. Brielle set her coffee down with exaggerated care, letting the numbers settle like bricks on her chest. "He's been untouchable for years because nobody's fought back. It's easier to walk away." "And let him win," Maya added. Brielle leaned back, her gaze tracing the cracks in the ceiling tile above her desk. "That's exactly why I can't. If I let him bury this case, it won't just be about Sterling Financial. It'll send a message to every firm, every client. We don't belong here." Maya nodded, her expression equal parts frustration and admiration. "So what's the plan?" Brielle's smile was razor sharp. "We play smarter." Courtroom maneuvers. When Brielle walked into Courtroom 6B that morning, she felt the shift the moment her heels hit the polished floor. The air was different, heavier, expectant. Hughes was already seated at the bench, his fingers drumming idly, but his gaze was locked on her the second she crossed the threshold. She could practically hear the gears turning in his head. She's not supposed to be here. She's not supposed to be this good. Nathan Caldwell, lead counsel for Sterling Financial, was leaning back in his chair, oozing confidence. His silver hair was styled to perfection, and his tie, deep crimson, the color of old money, gleamed under the courtroom lights. He offered Brielle a condescending half-smile, the kind that said, "You're already beaten. You just don't know it yet." "Let's proceed," Judge Hughes said, his tone the forced politeness of a man performing for an audience. Brielle rose, walking to the center of the room with deliberate steps, her briefcase clicking open with a satisfying snap. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit Exhibit 7B. Internal memos from Sterling Financial, documenting deceptive sales practices targeting elderly clients." Caldwell's chair scraped back as he stood, already shaking his head. "Objection, Your Honor. This memo is incomplete, lacks proper chain of custody." "Exhibit excluded," Hughes said, barely letting Caldwell finish. The words fell like a hammer. Brielle's fingers tightened around the edges of the exhibit, but her expression never faltered. "Understood, Your Honor," she said, her voice even. 1 document down, a dozen more to go. The next hour unfolded like a slow-motion wreck. Every piece of evidence, testimony, email correspondence, forensic financial analysis, was blocked. Sustained objections, chain of custody disputes, even perfectly admissible documents were tossed aside with a wave of Hughes' hand. It was a show, and Brielle was the unwilling star. Maya sat behind her, scribbling furiously in her legal pad, her teeth clenched so tight the muscle in her jaw jumped. Every time Hughes cut Brielle off, Maya would write a single word at the top of the page. Bias. After the third blocked motion, Brielle requested a sidebar. She stood shoulder to shoulder with Caldwell and Hughes at the bench, feeling the heat of Caldwell's smugness radiate off him like cheap cologne. "Your Honor," Brielle began, her voice soft but insistent, "I'd like to formally object to the exclusion of these exhibits. They were properly disclosed, authenticated, and directly relevant." Hughes' eyes narrowed slightly, as if the audacity of her speaking in his presence was a personal affront. "Your objection is noted and overruled." Brielle didn't back down. "I would also like the record to reflect my concern that these exclusions are part of a broader pattern of obstruction." Caldwell's smirk widened, but Hughes' face darkened. "Watch yourself, Ms. Townsend," Hughes said, his voice a low growl. "This courtroom is no place for conspiracy theories." "Understood, Your Honor," Brielle said, stepping back. But she knew what was happening. So did the jury. The turning point. Lunchtime came and went, but Brielle couldn't eat. She stood in the hallway, staring out the window at the downtown skyline, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. The fight wasn't just in the courtroom anymore. It was everywhere. In the whispers, in the sideways glances, in the silence when she walked into a room. Maya joined her, handing over a granola bar. "You need something. Starving yourself doesn't fight corruption." Brielle unwrapped it absently. "He's going to throw the whole case out." Maya's expression was grim. "Unless we give him something he can't ignore." That was when Brielle had an idea. Dangerous, maybe reckless, but exactly the kind of move that could flip the script. A calculated risk. When court reconvened, Brielle didn't rise immediately. She remained seated, flipping through her files, her brow furrowed as if searching for something. Judge Hughes noticed, his impatience practically vibrating from the bench. "Miss Townsend, are you prepared to proceed?" She stood slowly, holding up a copy of the very same exhibit Hughes had just excluded. "I'd like to request reconsideration on Exhibit 7B, she said, her voice even. "Under Rule 403. Hughes' jaw tensed. "Denied." Brielle's lips curled into a smile so faint only Maya saw it. "That's fine, Your Honor. I'll introduce it as impeachment evidence during cross-examination." Hughes' eyes flickered with brief uncertainty. He couldn't block it if it was used to impeach a witness's credibility. The defense's witness was about to walk into a minefield, and Brielle was holding the detonator. When the law fights back, the late afternoon light slanted through the narrow courthouse windows, turning the polished wood of the defense table into a strip of gleaming amber. Brielle Townsend sat, spine straight, every breath carefully measured as she held a copy of Exhibit 7B in her hand, the document Judge Hughes had so confidently buried hours earlier. It was more than a piece of paper. It was her weapon. Across the aisle, Nathan Caldwell lounged in his seat, fingers laced behind his head, the picture of a man who believed the war was already won. The Sterling financial team had rolled into court like kings, flanked by junior associates and interns who scurried after them, lugging briefcases that held nothing but smoke and mirrors. But Brielle had something they didn't: the truth. The bailiff's voice rang out. "Court is now in session." Judge Hughes ascended the bench with the slow, deliberate steps of a man who saw himself as royalty returning to his throne. The air in the courtroom thickened as he settled into place, straightening his robe with a tug that felt more personal than ceremonial. "We'll proceed with cross-examination," Hughes said, his gaze flickering down at Brielle. There was something in his expression, not quite fear, but a watchfulness that hadn't been there before. Brielle rose, walking to the center of the courtroom, her heels striking the floor in perfect rhythm. Every step was measured, each one a reminder to herself that this room, this fight, they were hers too. "Mr. Whittaker," Brielle began, her voice calm, almost gentle. The witness, Sterling Financial's former senior account manager, shifted in his seat, tugging at his tie. "You testified earlier that Sterling Financial's marketing materials were fully reviewed for accuracy before they were distributed to potential clients. Is that correct?" "Yes," Whittaker said, his fingers twitching in his lap. "By accuracy," Brielle continued, "you mean they were fact-checked against Sterling's actual product offerings and policies?" Whittaker hesitated. "That's right." Brielle walked back to her table, retrieving the copy of Exhibit 7B that Judge Hughes had excluded earlier. She held it up, letting the fluorescent lights catch on the printed Sterling Financial logo at the top. "This document," she said, "is an internal memo sent to your department on April 4th, 2022. It identifies discrepancies between the advertised benefits of the Guaranteed Growth Fund and the actual terms in the contracts clients signed. Were you aware of this memo?" "Objection," Caldwell said, already rising. "This document was excluded." "Your Honor," Brielle said smoothly, not missing a beat, "I am not introducing it as evidence. I am using it to impeach the witness's credibility. Under Rule 613, I'm entitled to question the witness about prior inconsistent statements. Hughes' jaw twitched. For a moment, Brielle thought he might overrule her out of sheer spite, but even he knew the rules, and the eyes on him. "Proceed," Hughes said, the word like rust scraped off iron. Brielle turned back to Whittaker, who was visibly sweating now. "Mr. Whittaker, were you aware of this memo?" Whittaker shifted uncomfortably. I don't recall." Brielle's smile was all teeth. "You don't recall receiving a memo directly from Sterling Financial's compliance department flagging misleading promises made to elderly clients?" Whittaker's eyes darted toward Caldwell, who gave the smallest shake of his head. A silent command to Stonewall. "No," Whittaker said. Brielle walked to the jury box, holding the document up so they could all see the bold red words stamped across the top. Internal notice. Non-disclosure outside compliance division. "Mr. Whittaker," Brielle said, turning back to the witness stand. "Your name is on the distribution list at the top of this memo. Did someone else sign your name?" Whittaker swallowed hard. I don't remember seeing it." Brielle stepped closer, lowering her voice, the courtroom so quiet now that the soft click of her heel felt like a gunshot. "Mr. Whittaker, is it your testimony under oath that you were not aware Sterling Financial was misleading clients?" His voice cracked. "I didn't realize." "Yes or no, sir?" The silence stretched until it nearly snapped. "Yes." The jury shifted, the tension in the room becoming something almost tangible. A living, breathing entity pressing down on everyone. Caldwell's smirk was gone. Hughes' fingers drummed against the bench, faster than usual, like his own nerves were betraying him. "Nothing further," Brielle said, returning to her seat. Her hands trembled slightly as she organized her papers, not from fear, but from adrenaline. She had cracked the first brick in Sterling's wall. It wouldn't be the last. A battle outside the courtroom. That evening, Brielle and Maya sat in Brielle's office, the tiny space filled with the comforting aroma of Maya's cinnamon tea. The sun had set, the streetlights outside flickering to life one by one, sending thin shafts of light across the cluttered desk. "You see his face when Whittaker folded." Maya grinned, tossing a rubber band ball between her hands. Caldwell looked like someone stole his inheritance. Brielle smiled faintly, but her mind was elsewhere. Hughes is going to retaliate. Maya's smile faded. "You really think so?" "He's not used to anyone pushing back," Brielle said softly. "Especially not someone like me." Maya set down her cup, her brow furrowed. "Then why is he still trying so hard?" "It's one case." Brielle shook her head. "It's not just this case. It's what happens if we win. It's proof that his power isn't absolute. And men like Hughes, they're addicted to power." Maya leaned against the desk. "So what's next?" Brielle tapped a thick binder on her desk, her motion to have Hughes' rulings reviewed by the Judicial Ethics Committee. "We fight him in two courts, the courtroom and the court of public opinion." Maya's eyes widened. "You're going after him publicly?" "I don't have a choice," Brielle said. "He's not just trying to bury this case. He's trying to bury me." The trap closes. The next morning, Brielle arrived at court to find her pre-trial motions folder missing from the defense table. Her stomach clenched, the familiar sense of dread washing over her. It was a small thing. A missing file. But in Hughes' courtroom, small things were often weapons. "Miss Townsend," Hughes said when court was called to order, "it appears you failed to properly file your amended witness list." Brielle froze. "That's incorrect, Your Honor. I filed it electronically and submitted hard copies to both the clerk and opposing counsel." "Neither has been received," Hughes said, his expression almost gleeful. "As such, I am excluding your remaining witnesses." The air drained from the room. Maya shot to her feet behind Brielle, whispering urgently, "I saw you file it. I was there." Brielle forced her expression neutral. "Your Honor, I have proof of submission. May I present it to the court?" Denied. Brielle stood frozen for a heartbeat. Then she turned to the jury, giving them a slow, deliberate glance, letting them see exactly what was happening. "In that case, Your Honor," she said, her voice steel wrapped in silk, "I have no further witnesses." The jury looked at each other, their unease growing with every blocked piece of evidence. Hughes thought he was untouchable, but Brielle was done playing defense. The tipping point. Brielle Townsend sat on the hard wooden bench in the courthouse corridor, her fingers pressed tightly around the edge of her phone, as if it were the only thing tethering her to reality. Her other hand rested on her knee, bouncing slightly, a nervous habit she'd never quite been able to shake. Through the heavy double doors, she could still hear the low murmur of voices, Sterling Financial's attorneys chuckling over lunch, reliving every victory Hughes handed them like gifts at a country club raffle. The hearing was over for the day, but the war was far from finished. The trap had been so smooth, so precise, it almost impressed her. Almost. The missing witness list, the exclusion of key evidence, and the constant roadblocks. It wasn't just obstruction, it was orchestration. Hughes had been playing this game long before Brielle ever stepped into his courtroom, and he'd been playing it against people like her, young, black, ambitious, since the first time he put on his robe. Maya appeared beside her, 2 cups of vending machine coffee in hand. Her usually playful expression was gone, replaced by something sharper, more focused. "I checked with the clerk's office again," she said quietly. "The witness list was filed, time-stamped, and everything. Someone removed it." Brielle took the cup, her fingers tightening around the cheap styrofoam. "And let me guess," she said, voice low, "nobody saw anything." Shocker. Maya sat beside her, her knee brushing Brielle's. "It's not enough for him to block the evidence. He wants to humiliate you." Brielle took a sip of the bitter coffee, swallowing hard to fight the knot building in her throat. "He's trying to teach me a lesson." "Well, he's about to learn one." Maya's voice was a sharp whisper, full of the fierce loyalty that had kept Brielle standing through law school, through their first impossible cases, and now through this. "We have the receipts, Bri. We know what he's doing. We're not just going to roll over." Brielle's phone vibrated in her hand. An email notification. She glanced down at the screen, her heart skipping a beat. Subject: Judicial Conduct Inquiry, Case 1463B. From Office of Judicial Oversight. Her breath caught in her throat. Maya peered over her shoulder. "Is that?" Brielle's fingers shook slightly as she opened the email. The message was brief, clinical. "Ms. Townsend, your recent inquiry into procedural irregularities has been received and formally escalated to the Office of Judicial Oversight. We will be assigning an independent investigator to review the case, including all relevant courtroom transcripts and evidence suppression claims. Please prepare a comprehensive list of concerns and supporting documentation. Respectfully, Senior Review Counsel, Judicial Oversight Division." Brielle's hand slowly lowered, her knuckles white around her phone. Maya's eyes widened. "He's under review." It wasn't a victory. Not yet. But it was a crack in the foundation, and cracks could grow. "We need to go deeper," Brielle said softly. "I want everything. Complaints, rulings, any case where he's pulled this stunt before. We build a pattern so clear they can't ignore it." Maya was already nodding. "I'll dig up everything tonight." Brielle stood, smoothing her blazer, her spine straightening with renewed resolve. "He's been fighting me with shadows and silence." She turned, eyes locked on the courtroom door. "Tomorrow, we fight back with daylight." The Whisper Campaign. It started with a whisper. A single phone call to a former law clerk, someone Brielle remembered from her internship days, someone who'd left Hughes Court mysteriously, their promising career quietly derailed. Then another call to a public defender who'd faced Hughes' wrath in a civil rights case. Then a call to a legal aid attorney who'd fought him on housing discrimination rulings. The stories spilled out like floodwater breaching a dam. "He called me little lady every time I stood up. He blocked my evidence, But the opposing counsel, all white men, got theirs admitted without a word. I filed a complaint once. It disappeared. Each voice added another brick to the wall of truth Brielle and Maya were building. It wasn't just bias. It was systemic, intentional, a pattern so blatant it was almost arrogant, because Hughes had never expected anyone to piece it together. Brielle sat at her desk, highlighter in hand, circling dates and names, drawing arrows from case to case. The web grew larger with every connection. It wasn't just her case. Hughes had spent decades building a personal fiefdom, where justice only applied if you looked the part, and if you didn't, your voice was silenced before you ever got to speak. Maya's voice broke through the quiet. "We've got 10 attorneys willing to submit affidavits." Brielle's pen stilled. 10. 4 women, 3 black men, 2 Latina attorneys, and 1 native public defender. Maya's smile was grim. "All of them have stories." Brielle exhaled slowly. "We don't just file a complaint." Maya leaned in. "We built a case, a public reckoning." The next morning, before court reconvened, Brielle held an impromptu press conference on the courthouse steps. The air was cool, the sky heavy with the promise of rain, but the reporters were already waiting, their cameras aimed, pens poised. Maya stood beside her, a bulging folder clutched in her arms. "Thank you for coming." Brielle began, her voice calm despite the weight in her chest. "I'm here today because the integrity of our judicial system is at stake." Microphones were thrust forward. Cameras zoomed in. "I have evidence," Brielle continued, "that Judge Leonard Hughes has engaged in a long-standing pattern of discriminatory conduct, particularly against female attorneys and attorneys of color." A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd. "I have documentation showing that evidence suppression, procedural manipulation, and outright intimidation are not isolated incidents in his court. They are part of a calculated effort to deny equal justice." Maya stepped forward, handing out copies of the initial complaint packet, 10 pages long, filled with affidavits, case summaries, and statistical breakdowns. "This is not personal," Brielle said firmly. "This is about restoring trust. Every attorney deserves a fair hearing, and every client deserves a fair trial. Judge Hughes has systematically denied that to people who look like me, and we will not be silent anymore." The questions erupted, too many at once, but Brielle held her ground. "Will you demand his removal? Are you worried about retaliation? What does this mean for your case?" Brielle's response was steady, deliberate. "I'm not afraid of the truth. I trust the facts to speak for themselves." And with that, she turned and walked back inside, back into the lion's den, with the storm she'd just unleashed at her heels. The judge's fury. Court resumed under a different kind of silence, the silence of a man who knew his secrets were slipping through his fingers. Hughes' face was a shade too pale, his usual smug confidence brittle around the edges. He knew. He knew she'd gone public. "Miss Townsend," Hughes said, his voice cold. "A word in chambers." Brielle met his gaze head-on. "I'd prefer to keep all conversations on the record, Your Honor." His jaw tightened. "I insist." The gallery was too quiet. Even Caldwell looked uncomfortable. Brielle stood. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I decline." Hughes' knuckles went white on the bench, but he couldn't argue with her right to refuse. Not in front of the jury. Not now. "Very well," Hughes said, voice thin with barely contained fury. "Proceed." Brielle returned to her seat. The gloves were off, and the whole world was watching. The cost of truth. The wind whipped around Brielle Townsend as she stood on the courthouse steps, her back to the towering stone facade, her face to the press. The early morning sunlight turned the lenses of the cameras into harsh glints, like dozens of tiny spotlights trained directly on her. Her heart thundered beneath her tailored navy blazer, but her expression never wavered. She'd spoken her truth. Publicly. On record. Now the system would have to decide whether to fight her, or to cleanse itself. Behind the glass doors of the courthouse, she could see Maya pacing in the hallway, her phone pressed to her ear, her expression a mixture of pride and fear. Maya had always been the one to temper Brielle's fire, to pull her back from the edge when she wanted to fight every injustice with bare hands. This time, though, even Maya knew there was no turning back. The press conference had been a nuclear detonation in the tightly controlled world of courthouse politics. Hughes' allies, the old guard, had spent decades quietly covering for him, just enough plausible deniability to protect him from formal complaints. But Brielle hadn't just filed a complaint. She put his corruption under a national spotlight. It had taken less than an hour for the first blowback to hit. Her office phone rang with thinly veiled threats, senior partners at corporate firms warning her that she was making herself unemployable. Judges who had always greeted her with polite smiles suddenly wouldn't meet her eye in the hallways. Even her law school mentor, Professor Daniels, left a voicemail that danced awkwardly around the words career suicide. Brielle had expected all of it. What she didn't expect was the letter slipped under her office door. The letter. It was hand-delivered, no postage, no return address. Just her name in thick black ink on the front of a legal-sized envelope. Maya found it when she came in early, sitting right at the threshold like it had been placed there with care. Brielle unfolded it slowly, her fingers tracing the unfamiliar handwriting. "Walk away now, Ms. Townsend, before you lose everything, including the people you love." There was no signature, but it didn't need one. Maya stared at it over Brielle's shoulder, her breath audible in the quiet office. "You think it's Hughes?" Brielle shook her head. "No, Hughes is arrogant. If he wanted to scare me, he'd do it in open court, with that smug little smile." Then Sterling. Maya's voice was hushed. "Or one of the firms that protect companies like Sterling," Brielle said. "Either way, they want me to know they're watching." Maya's jaw clenched. "We should report it." Brielle folded the letter carefully, slipping it into her desk drawer. "We don't have proof. They'll call it a hoax, a misunderstanding." It's noise." Brielle's voice was sharper than she intended. She forced a breath through her nose and softened. "It's meant to shake me. It won't." But when Maya left the room, Brielle locked the drawer and placed a hand on the cool wood, grounding herself against the cold prickle of fear working its way up her spine. They were escalating, which meant she was getting close. The public turns. By midday, the courthouse was practically vibrating with whispers. Court clerks, public defenders, even court security guards, all murmuring the same thing. "Did you see the story? Did you hear what Townsend said?" Judge Hughes, seriously. The local news stations had seized on her press conference like wolves scenting blood, running highlight clips in hourly rotation. Screenshots of her affidavit were circulating on legal Twitter, and the hashtags #JudicialBias and #JusticeForAll were trending nationally. The community was watching, not just the lawyers, but the people Hughes had ruled against. Families displaced by wrongful foreclosure cases, employees crushed by corporate suits Hughes had fast-tracked to dismissal, and public defenders who had fought losing battles in his courtrooms for decades. The crowd gathered outside the courthouse by the afternoon was different than the usual gaggle of reporters. These were everyday people, retirees, students, activists holding hastily made signs with slogans like, "Fair courts for all. No justice under Hughes. Brielle stands, we stand." From her office window, Brielle watched the crowd swell. The chant starting low, gaining power. "She's becoming a symbol," Maya said softly, standing beside her. Brielle exhaled slowly. Symbols are easy to break. Not this time. Inside the lion's den. The next morning, Judge Hughes sat at his bench, face carved from stone, as if every muscle had been locked into place. His robe seemed too tight, his usually smooth hands twitching slightly on the polished wood of his bench. He knew the world was watching. The gallery was packed. Reporters, legal observers, community members. The crowd from outside had filtered in, filling every creaking wooden pew. Hugh's power, once absolute within these walls, was now under siege from all sides. Brielle stood at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded neatly before her. She could feel the heat of the stares, both support and skepticism. The air itself seemed weighted, every breath a quiet rebellion. "Miss Townsend," Hughes said, his voice the forced calm of a man containing a storm. "Before we begin, I'd like to remind all counsel that this courtroom is not a venue for personal grievances." Brielle smiled. Calm, composed, lethal. "Of course, Your Honor. I'm here to discuss evidence." The word hung in the air. Evidence. The very thing Hughes had spent years burying. Hughes cleared his throat, but there was a faint crack in his voice. "Proceed." "The collapse begins." One by one, Brielle introduced her exhibits, the same exhibits Hughes had excluded before. This time, she wasn't arguing their admissibility. She was arguing their suppression. "As the record reflects," Brielle said, her tone measured, "these documents were properly disclosed under Rule 26. They were authenticated and independently verified. Their exclusion serves no legal basis, only obstruction." "Objection." Caldwell shot to his feet. "This is grandstanding." "No," Brielle countered. "This is accountability." Hughes' gavel slammed down. "Both of you, enough." But the jury was listening. And so was the gallery. "Your Honor," Brielle continued, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet, "if this court intends to suppress evidence critical to proving systematic fraud against elderly citizens, I will formally request judicial recusal on the grounds of demonstrated bias." The courtroom froze. Hughes' face paled slightly, a flicker of fear in his eyes. "On what grounds?" he demanded, though his voice lacked its usual force. Brielle held up a copy of her complaint, the one filed with judicial oversight. "On these grounds." The gallery erupted in murmurs, reporters scrambling for their phones, fingers flying across screens. Maya stood at the back, arms crossed, nodding slightly. The curtain had been pulled back. Hughes was no longer the unquestioned king of his courtroom. He was a defendant in his own trial. Aftermath. That evening, Brielle stood in her office, staring at the city lights blinking outside her window. The noise of the day had quieted, but the storm still raged inside her. The system had fought to silence her, and she had shouted louder. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She considered ignoring it, then answered. "Miss Townsend," a low voice said. "This is Senior Investigator Daniel Price from Judicial Oversight. We've received your complaint, and we have some questions." Brielle's breath caught. "I'll answer everything," she said quietly. There was a pause. "You've made some powerful enemies," Price said. "Be careful." Brielle smiled, small but certain. "I've been careful my whole life," she replied. It's time they were careful too. The verdict that changed everything. The hallway outside the Judicial Review hearing room smelled of polished wood and disinfectant, the kind of sterile scent that clung to places where lives were decided in whispers and red ink. Brielle Townsend stood at the far end, hands gripping the edge of the marble window ledge, staring at the street far below. Her reflection stared back at her, the dark circles under her eyes, the tension in her jaw, the poised mask that had become second nature. Behind her, Maya paced, her kitten heels clicking softly against the tile. "They're gonna twist this," Maya said. "You know they are." Brielle took a slow breath. "Let them. I'm not here to play their game." Maya stopped pacing, leaning her shoulder against the window beside Brielle. "You already exposed Hughes. That's a win." "No." Brielle's gaze hardened. "Not until it's official. Not until every case he rigged, every family he broke, every voice he silenced gets heard." There were still senior partners at white shoe firms calling her arrogant, judicial associations calling her too aggressive. Even professors from her law school, men who once praised her work, now offering backhanded warnings about her tone and how she was damaging her career. Brielle was past caring. Her career was no longer the point. Justice was. The double doors creaked open at the far end of the hallway. A young clerk, barely out of law school, peered out. "Miss Townsend, we're ready." Brielle stepped away from the window, squaring her shoulders. "Let's go." The review hearing. The review panel sat behind an elevated bench, not unlike a courtroom, but this time, the judges weren't in robes. They wore suits, professional but stripped of the pomp Hughes had hidden behind. There were 5 of them. 2 women, 3 men, all seasoned legal minds whose reputations were carved in stone long before Brielle was born. Across the room, Judge Leonard Hughes sat with his attorney, a gray-haired pit bull named Victor Langston, whose entire personality was distilled into 2 words: deflect and attack. Hughes' expression was carved from marble, but Brielle saw the tightness in his fingers, the twitch at the corner of his eye. He wasn't untouchable anymore. The lead panelist, a stately woman with salt and pepper hair, adjusted her glasses. "Miss Townsend, you may present your summary." Brielle stood, the weight of every victim, every case Hughes had tainted, resting on her shoulders. She approached the table, her fingers brushing the edges of her neatly organized folder, the familiar touch grounding her. "Members of the panel," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I am here today not just on behalf of my clients, but on behalf of every attorney, every plaintiff, every defendant who was denied a fair hearing in Judge Hughes' courtroom." She placed a single page on the panel's desk, a list of names. "These are the attorneys of color and female counsel who, over the past 10 years, appeared before Judge Hughes in civil litigation. In over 90% of cases, their motions were denied at rates statistically impossible to attribute to chance." She placed a second page beside the first, a chart. "These are the rulings in favor of corporate defendants in Hughes Court, 88% in favor, with evidence consistently excluded when presented by attorneys representing low-income clients." She placed a third page down, a timeline. "And this is a pattern of procedural manipulation, including unfiled documents, fabricated scheduling orders, and cases reassigned away from Hughes when corporate counsel objected to his courtroom." She stepped back, letting the pages speak. "The law," Brielle said quietly, "only works when it belongs to everyone." Judge Hughes twisted it into a weapon. Against attorneys like me, against clients who dared to demand justice, against the very principles this profession claims to uphold. The panelists were silent, their expressions unreadable, but Brielle could feel the shift in the air, the weight of undeniable truth. Victor Langston stood, smoothing his tie with the confidence of a man who believed every fight could be reduced to paperwork. Respectfully, Langston began, "What Ms. Townsend is presenting is not evidence. It's grievance, a collection of unrelated incidents woven into a narrative designed to punish a respected jurist for a few unfavorable rulings." Brielle's jaw tightened, but she stayed seated. "This is character assassination," Langston continued. "Judge Hughes has served with distinction for decades. His rulings may not always favor plaintiffs, but that does not constitute bias. Ms. Townsend is exploiting social climate for personal gain." Brielle stood before Langston could finish. "Permission to respond." The panel chair nodded. Brielle stepped forward. "This isn't about losing a case. This is about patterns, patterns supported by data, by affidavits from attorneys across this district, and by transcripts from Hughes' own courtroom." She held up a thick binder. "I'm submitting sworn statements from 10 attorneys detailing identical experiences, procedural irregularities, sexist and racially charged comments, and evidence suppression." Langston tried to object, but the panel chair raised a hand. "We've reviewed the preliminary evidence," the chair said, her voice cool, "and it warrants further investigation." The room went still. Hughes' hands curled into fists on the table. Brielle didn't smile. Not yet. The real fight. That afternoon, Brielle returned to her office, the weight of what came next pressing down hard. Judicial misconduct cases rarely ended in outright removal. The system hated eating its own. But even a public inquiry would shatter Hugh's image. Maya sat cross-legged on Briel's desk, scrolling through her phone. "You're blowing up online." "Great," Briel muttered. "No, seriously." Maya turned her screen around. #justice for Briel was trending. Videos of her press conference had been viewed over 2 million times. Legal TikTok was dissecting Hugh's rulings like a crime scene. "You're becoming the face of legal reform," Maya said softly. Briel's stomach turned. "I don't want to be a symbol." "Well," Maya said, "too late." The last gambit. The next day, Hugh's attorney filed an emergency motion, a motion to dismiss the misconduct investigation on the grounds that it was tainted by biased public pressure. It was a long shot, but Briel knew why they did it. It was about buying time. That night, Briel received a second letter. This one slid under her apartment door. "You were warned. This will not end well for you." She held it under the light, her hand trembling for only a moment before she crushed it into a ball. "Come at me," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm still here." The final decision. A week later, the Judicial Review panel reconvened. Judge Hughes sat with Langston, but there was no confidence left in him, just a pale shadow of the man who had ruled his courtroom like a king. The lead panelist folded her hands. "After review of the evidence, testimony, and procedural history, this panel finds Judge Leonard Hughes engaged in systematic bias, obstruction of justice, and conduct unbecoming of the bench." The words were quiet, clinical, but they were the hammer that shattered Hughes' kingdom. Effective immediately, the chair continued, "Judge Hughes is removed from his judicial position. All cases heard in his court over the past 7 years will be subject to independent review." The gasp that rippled through the room felt like oxygen rushing back into a suffocating space. Briel's hands shook slightly on the table, but she forced herself to stay calm. This wasn't just her victory. It belonged to every client Hughes had cheated, every lawyer he belittled, every person he tried to silence. Hughes rose slowly, his face a mask of disbelief. For once, he had no words. Briel did. As he passed her table, she stood. "The law doesn't belong to you," she said softly. "It belongs to all of us." Hughes didn't respond. He walked out of the hearing room. A relic consigned to history. Maya squeezed Briel's hand so tightly it almost hurt. "You did it." Briel Townsend didn't smile, but her heart beat steady and strong. "We all did."